Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another in our series of interviews with the participants and contributors to this year's Coronavirus and International Affairs Conference, which is scheduled for Friday, 17 April. Again, registration you see behind me on my virtual screen. Registration is required but free. It helps us to avoid Zoom bombing and all those other things. And we hope to welcome you. We hope you've had a chance to look at some of the other videos. They will stay up on our conference website. And so for today's videos, we've been almost all over the world. We've been to various parts of Europe. We've been to the former Soviet Union and Israel. We've been to Africa, the Caribbean, and of course, China. With this interview, we will turn our attention to Germany, and it is my great pleasure for that purpose to introduce you to Nicolas Scolz. He is an independent researcher, graduate of Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich, with experience in emerging security challenges division of NATO, the Sino-German cooperation industry, and the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. We welcome him. He is also just a great researcher, and I can tell you that personally. Okay. And with that, I'd like to welcome Nicolas, and I want to welcome you with a question. So here's my question. We've already foreshadowed, we're going to be talking about Germany. So I was hoping that you'd start by talking to us about what the situation in Germany is in the context both of its organization as a federal state and in the European context.
Thank you very much, Larry, for the short introduction. Pleasure is on my side. I had looked at the other interviews you guys did so far, so indeed I think it's a great start to just give you a perspective, a personal insight about what's happening in Germany. First of all, I think what is interesting to note is the way the German government approached this crisis in terms of the measures taken. In this regard, what we had was not a ban for people going outside their houses specifically, but more something called like a contact lock. That means only two people at the same time are allowed to go outside other than family. This proved so far to be quite effective. I guess that also international media have reported that Germany mastered the situation quite well comparatively to other states. At the same time, of course, the government, federal government and state governments are uncertain about how, I think it was yesterday, and they have finally reached a consensus about keeping the contact lock alive to the 3rd of May. However, to open specific economic sectors, so actors have more leeway also to secure their living. Schools and universities will also be closed to the 3rd of May, but there will probably be some minor differences between different states, how to handle this approach. So you have quite a centralized attitude towards this crisis, but nevertheless, states play a role and will play a big role in the future. What is interesting, though, is also that criticism mounts. Although Germany fares quite well in comparison to the international arena, there are scientists and medical researchers who pointed out that the measures taken to curtail personal freedom might have been too strict. However, these opinions play so far still a minor role in the public discussions.
I see. How has the discussion been in Germany, and to what extent has there been any kind of political ramifications of the division of authority in managing the COVID crisis between the German federal government and the land?
Yeah, well, as I said, there are different approaches. States have different approaches, and the federal government and states government are not always on the same page. Practically speaking, what that means is that, of course, different states have different stakeholders to protect, different industries and voter shares to worry about. I'll give you an example. I think that what might be really might become quite a big problem in the course of this crisis or after the crisis. How depends on how long we will still be having COVID-19 around. Is the relationship between richer and more poor states and how they are adversely affected. So one big issue is that inequality, economical inequality between those states might arise, as well as social inequality within states and all over Germany as well, because some people, or well, not some people, but a lot of people are on the verge of losing their jobs or have already lost their jobs, and that are particularly people who are already quite vulnerable to crisis. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. So that actually, as you were talking, I was thinking, oh my goodness, is this sort of one of the ghosts of the old division? And it really has gone back in time, but you wonder whether it's still there. Does this reflect some of the old divisions between the former West Germany and the former East Germany? And then the second question is,
Fantastic.
will these differences in treatment and the affect the relative ability of the 2 or 3 major parties in Germany to get adherence? That is are there going to be a lot of people who may be shifting allegiances on the basis of how angry or happy they are with the government's performance, either at the federal level or at the land level?
Yeah. So basically, to first touch upon your first question, it's a very, very fascinating, very interesting question, because of course the divisions between West and East Germany have been an issue for quite a long time, and they could never be successfully bridged, finally bridged. It's an ongoing issue, and how this plays out, I'm not sure, of course, or well, at least for people from outside of Germany, it's quite interesting to know that Eastern Germany has not been affected by COVID-19 as much as West Germany has been, and by far margins. So that is really an interesting picture, and one wonders what this will entail. If this is possibly, well, one could wonder if this is actually good for East Germany, or whether there will be other repercussions, economic repercussions, which will be hitting East Germany harder in the medium long term.
Right. What about with respect to the allegiance and the political parties standing in Germany?
That's another good question. And Larry, if I could predict the future, I would probably not be an independent researcher, but working as a renowned European think tank, or else. But I would say so far, I think that what we see is that this crisis has the potential to magnify social divisions, which have been already there, through fostered also through the crisis before, whether it's the immigration crisis, financial crisis. And there's no doubt that, in my opinion at least, that this social discohesion will find an entrance into, for example, heightened division in social media. And the question, of course, is what that plays out. There will be more chaos, but who will profit from this chaos is another question. We will see.
All right. Well, and actually, that's a very nice segue into my next question. I was wondering, we've been talking about COVID-19 in a variety of different perspectives. One of them that we haven't talked about as much, and it might be useful to talk about it in this context, especially in the context as in Germany, in the center of the EU, in a sense, is I was wondering if maybe we can put the topic of COVID the COVID crisis into a historical and European perspective, both in terms of what came before, what is now, and what comes next within that historical and European, German and European context?
Well, first of all, I think that, at least from a European perspective, we were quite whipped by crises in the last 10 to 15 years, right? I mean, the Europeans know all about it. It was the financial crisis, the immigration crisis. We had Trump and the greatest fears, what might come next. We had Brexit, and finally there's COVID-19. And the magnitude of the crisis is such that there has never something like this before. And indeed, German politicians would say that the current crisis is actually the biggest crisis since Second World War. And that's how it is framed. And I think if you consider that it's actually a global crisis, it's a truly global crisis, I think one can stick with that. And in that way, I would follow up with a second thought, and that is that I think that this crisis isn't so far. There's an old dimension to it, or an older dimension, and in a more or a new dimension. And the old dimension is that we have talked about ecological devastation and environmental degradation for a long time, and I think we should all remember that COVID-19 is a virus, and it's also part of this crisis, this ecological crisis we witness now, and which has come to the forefront of global media in the last couple of years. So that's a question. That's I think not a question, but I think it's just something to keep in mind. The second thing, in my opinion, is that this global crisis, this global ecological crisis, really shows that we reached a level of complexity in the world which has never been there, and that this complex system, this global complex system, exhibits tendencies towards disorder and order as well. So some people would say, well, everything is going back to the nation state. Some people would say, oh, it's actually maybe a chance to foster the spirit of internationalism, or in the framework of the EU, in the context of the EU, to actually put yourself together and finally find the political cohesion in the European arena again, what we as Europeans lacked in the recent past. But I think that this dialectic, or this confrontation between nationalism and globalism, is something which is there, which will be there for a long time, and it's not going to vanish. It's a tendency towards disordered order, and it probably will go hand in hand. We will see more, or we will see a greater taste of nation states to get control again over the policy sphere, but we will also see greater tendencies, maybe on the side of the civil society, to enhance global cooperation. So that would be my key takeaway from that.
Well, that is actually very interesting, and now you've provoked a question from out of this, because it really it sets the context of the virus within a leading state that is not the US, within a leading amalgamation of states, which is not traditional multilateralism. And that brings back what appears to be an old ghost, nationalism versus globalization in a new context or an old context. But I want to ask a question. As you were talking about that, I said, well, maybe what it also does is bring up a new binary, a new contradiction, not necessarily between nationalism and globalization, but this is something that you brought up in answering the question about the historical context, the European historical context.
Sure.
Maybe what we are talking about here, and this is what I hope that you'd be able to have some thoughts on, maybe we're not talking about nationalism versus globalization, although we are, but we are all looking backwards, but we're also talking looking forward as a contradiction between politics and administration. And what I mean by that is it possible to view, and you see this in Germany, you see this in Russia, in Israel, in the United States, and certainly in China, that what we're seeing is the inauguration of the age of the technocrat and of the institutional administrator, and the sunsetting of the age of the great democratically elected or elected through the politics of a vanguard party politician. That in fact, this is no longer the age of politics, but it is now the age of the technocrat, of the institutional administrator. Every time you see pictures of the great political leaders, the people who are actually talking are the doctors, the WHO administrators, the medical personnel. And so I was wondering if maybe in looking at COVID-19 and in the way it's reshaping the state, but also reshaping the way in which relations between states are formulated, that we might be as useful, it might be as useful to talk about COVID-19 in terms of what it means for the reshaping of governance from politics to technocratic organization and management, as it is to talk about it from moving from globalization to nationalism. And I wondered if you might have a reaction to that.
Well, wow, that was a question, and already quite a explanation. Well, I try my best, Larry. I think that this dualism plays, as you said, out as well on the between politics and technocracy or bureaucracy, whatever you want to call it. And I would go so far, again, that I think that we see both. We will see both. We will need, on the one hand, we will see the need. Maybe we could call it like, we will see the need for more programming, also in regards to data-driven governance, right? We will see the need for more order, for more bureaucracy, technocratic management, but we will at the same time need more space, more political space for collaboration, for autonomy, for conflict, to not drift into a society or into a world where we stick with, I would call it planning. We can call it data governance, we could call it planning. In that sense, it's the same that could inhibit innovation. And it could also create the fallacy in our minds that technology is the key to solve the world's issues. And it's not. It's a means to an end. And in that way, it's not different. It's not much different as when Clausewitz said that war is another way of politics.
Okay. Yeah. And as you were talking, of course, I'm thinking, oh my goodness. And for those of you who know this area, of course, you'll either groan or laugh. I'm thinking of another Nicolas Luhmann, and what he might have to say about social ordering, which was what prompted my question in this regard. We are coming close to the end of our time together, and I was wondering if you had some, in closing this up, if you have some larger picture thinking or insights, or even smaller pictures or insights that you might want to leave us with, if only as an encouragement to come and watch you during the course of the conference roundtable.
Well, I could imagine. So I think that there's one interesting thing I read recently. There was something from the Future of Humanities Institute at, I think it was Oxford, and it was an essay written by Nick Boston about the world vulnerability thesis. And in this essay, basically he put forward a couple of scenarios on how to deal with a very interconnected interconnected world, a complex, systemic world in which, well, everything is interconnected. So what he puts forward is the idea that the risks associated, for example, with pandemics, but also terrorism and weapons of mass destruction, technological risks like AI, is that potentially what we need to come up with is large-scale surveillance and preventive policing in order to mitigate these risks that are, as the thesis states, could really be pose a systemic risk to civilization itself. And in that regard, he, for example, talks about an idea to potentially give every citizen some kind of freedom tag, a freedom tag that is monitored by so-called officers, police officers, sitting somewhere in data centers who can monitor what everybody is doing in real time and intervene if anything suspiciously happens. And then in the end, he says, well, of course, that's a rigid idea. That's a really rigid idea, and potentially it's not politically feasible to implement such a system, such a surveillance system. But then he states it could be implemented if there is a crisis big enough that will make people believe that it's inevitable to establish such a system, and makes it politically feasible hereby. And well, I think this essay was written before COVID-19, and then COVID-19 came, and we of course see currently a lot of attempts all around the world by governments to harness the power of technology to track down COVID-19. Of course, with potential negative side effects, right? We see even in Europe that, for example, in Hungary, the head of state, I don't want to say the name now, is using this crisis to actually lead his country towards the tracks of dictatorships. So in that regard, I think that was really interesting, and I wonder what other people might have to say to that. If a freedom tag is actually the solution to potential future problems in our world, and well, what kind of world that will be is, of course, another question.
Well, and that is a fabulous provocation, and one that ought to put the fear. If people are watching this at night, it's a perfect nightmare story, unless you actually like that kind of thing, in which case maybe you'll hear the story a little differently. And I'm not going to suggest.
Well, I mean, just to follow up. I mean, I don't want to. I'm not arguing against the use of technology in any sense.
Yeah.
I just think it was a really interesting. It was a really interesting play of thought. I think that's the way you call it in English, right?
Right.
Thought,
and a very necessary one in these times. Where it takes you, no one knows. But absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that for example, what Edgar Morin, a system thinker, a French system thinker, would say is that what we need are not only programs, but also a strategy. And if you don't think about the risks coming along with the programs, well, then you surely don't have a strategy.
And now we are at the opening. We have just opened the door to a new world and a new world order. And with that, leaving our audience hanging, I hope you all come back to our conference on Friday. Hopefully we will get to some of these issues. Again, Nicolas, thank you so much for taking the time for an extraordinarily engaging conversation. I really appreciate it. Thank you,
Larry. Pleasure is on my side.
And we will see you at the conference.
Take care. Bye.